Hey guys, welcome to Coding After 30. Of course, I have a guest. I have Sid from DevOps Directive. I've been meaning to have him on forever. And to be honest, when I first started out on YouTube, he was the first one, and his channel was way bigger than mine. And like, even though he's fairly new to the YouTube world as well, but he's like, yeah, sure, I'll come on the show. And we've just been trying to find a time for like a while now, but I'm glad he's here. And so we're going to talk about how he started. He also switched careers in the sense that he went from mechanical engineering to now he does a lot of DevOps stuff. And I'd like him to share his experience with us. And before we do, if you guys are in the comments, let me know if my audio is working or not, if you could hear both of us. Say
check,
hello.
1 2.
Yeah. So I know I could hear Sid, so I know we're working, but just in case, you never know how YouTube does it. But with that being said, let's just, we'll jump into it. And actually, I just realized it's the 4th of July weekend this weekend. So we'll see like what it's going to be in terms of people tuning in. But I'm going to definitely like break this down to clips because I really want to hear your side of things. So before we start, why don't you introduce yourself in terms of like what you did before, what you're doing now and how that transition was for you.
Sure, yeah. And thanks so much for having me on. Yeah, like you said, we connected a long time ago and have just had trouble scheduling. So glad to be here. And we both have our classic YouTuber lights in the background. So that's how you know we're serious. So my name's Sid. I studied mechanical engineering, both undergrad and did a master's degree in mechanical engineering. Went off and was in industry for about 5.5 years in a variety of research positions across mechanical engineering. So I did some stuff related to advanced manufacturing and 3D printing. I did some work on control systems, and that was the focus of my master's, was on control systems. So that included some work on satellite control systems. So thinking about pointing and stabilizing a satellite in space. Also worked on some controls for high energy lasers. So the mirrors that point and steer lasers. So figuring out how to stabilize those and track a target. So that was a lot of fun. And I realized as I was doing that the most fun I was having were on the pieces of it where I was writing software. So yes, there was a mechanical design component to all of those systems, but it was right at the intersection of software engineering. And so more and more, I tried to volunteer for the software aspects of those projects. And so I went from maybe having 100% mechanical to slowly over time adding more software and shifting it such that eventually I was doing maybe 60% software,
wow,
20% mechanical, 20% systems. And then in 2018, I decided to make the jump from that role and applied to a bunch of companies and startups here in San Francisco. Ended up joining a health tech startup as a full stack engineer, and then have been doing software ever since. Was full stack at first, and then eventually realized that the infrastructure and the DevOps portions of the engineering process were one, what I was best at, and two, what was most exciting to me. And so the last year and a half or so, I've really shifted into focusing on those and trying to stay away from the front end as much as possible.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. And I got a second on-day pointer here. That's really effing cool. Like you describing working with lasers and satellites. And for me, like, it's like every kid's dream to do that. And for you, you still kind of like, even though you enjoyed it, you're like, I really like the software, portion of it. So what really draws you in? Like why like software,
Yeah, I think there's a number of reasons. One that really stands out to me is the fact that with software, your impact, it can be decoupled from the hours that you put in. As in, like, if you write a piece of code that can accomplish a task, now your time is no longer coupled to you accomplishing that task, and it can be run not infinite, but close to infinite number of times. And so being able to sort of scale that impact and use software as a lever to do so was really exciting to me. I think in the mechanical world, like if you are sitting there designing a part in CAD, like, yes, there's some things you can do to become more efficient and better at it, but it's always
time.
Tied to what you're doing. Yeah.
And that's like amazing. Like, and like, that's actually a really good reason if people are wondering if software engineering is a good fit for them. from that standpoint of scalability, because it's true that if you do things right, there's definitely potential to scale and grow like on a massive like scale. And even though everything takes work, no matter what you do, software engineering does offer that. Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah, for sure, for sure.
Yeah, and so you started doing like more DevOps, and what, like, describe like a typical DevOps day for you. Like, what do you do? What do clients ask? And how do you go, like, in a big overview, so if people want to familiarize themselves with what that even means?
Yeah, so maybe I'll start by just trying to define what DevOps even is, and then I can talk through what a typical day is.
Yeah.
And so DevOps is a combination of two words, development and operations. And so historically, those have been two relatively separate functions. You have the development team who is writing the software application, and then you have the operations team who is taking that application and running it on a fleet of servers somewhere, historically on-prem in some data center that your company owned. Now it's usually in the cloud on AWS or GCP. That separation causes some challenges where if the application developer isn't thinking about how their system that they're building is going to interact with that underlying infrastructure, they might make some design choices that are not optimal. Conversely, if you have someone who's operating the software and encountering bugs, inevitably there will be bugs, but they aren't familiar with what is actually inside that black box that was delivered to them from the software engineering team, that can be a real challenge. And so DevOps is all about bringing those two things closer together and how you can include an operational mindset as you're building the software. And then also on the other side, having software engineers more involved in the operations component so they understand what the application is doing, what all the nuances are. And so when you do come across an issue, it's easier to solve it. And so it's all about automating, adding instrumentation, turning things that used to be point and click in the GUI or manual processes into code that you can deploy automatically from your version control system. So that's sort of a high level description of what DevOps is. Me as a consultant, I work with a number of clients, usually startups who are starting to scale their businesses. One client in particular, I essentially helped to roll out a platform called Kubeflow. So people have heard of Kubernetes probably.
Yeah.
Kubernetes is a way to deploy your applications onto a cloud. It kind of abstracts away the underlying compute resources into one. It's almost like an OS for your cloud is one way to think about it. Kubeflow is a layer on top of that. So I helped a client migrate their workloads onto this platform. Another client, they wanted to essentially build an automated system to take data that they already had about their customers and turn it into a static website as kind of an upsell for their product. So let's say they have all these customers who were like contractors in the sense of like building construction, small businesses, that what they did for them is do their payroll and timesheets and stuff. So they had all this data about those customers. A lot of those customers were relatively low in terms of their technical capabilities. They didn't have a website even necessarily.
Yeah.
And so what I did for them is help to automate the process of taking this data that they had and building out a static website from those data and deploying it onto a GCP bucket with Cloudflare in front of it. And so it essentially enabled them to, for all of their customers, generate a website, and then they could offer that as kind of an upgraded feature within their platform. So, I mean, there's just all sorts of things. It ranges from helping people upgrade their infrastructure, adding new pipelines and automations to their systems. Yeah, it really varies.
Yeah, so the next, I guess, question would be like, how do you get started in that? Like, for instance, like in the web development, it's like, okay, learn HTML, CSS, JavaScript, React, build a bunch of portfolios, and you're on your path. But how do you get started in DevOps, and what are the steps that you took?
Sure, yeah. So I think it's really important that people do come at it with some experience from either side of the spectrum. So you could be a developer for some time, you understand how applications are built. You might be more of like a sysadmin person who is operating the servers directly. Having some of that background will be hugely beneficial as you start to think about DevOps. So I don't think it's it's a career path that people should jump into right away, like just getting started, because there's so many pieces, there's so many moving pieces that it would be very hard to internalize any one of them. Like, you'll see some bug and just, where do you even start? If you at least started on one side, you know, you have a set of tools in your toolbox of like, what's the first step in trying to debug this issue? So yeah, I'd say that, one, have some background in either software development or IT operations before you try to get into DevOps. And then two, the way that I did it is exactly that. I was a full stack engineer. We had this company I was working for. The deployment was a number of services deployed into Kubernetes on GCP. One of our employees who had been managing a lot of that stuff essentially decided to move on from the company. And so there was this open need for someone to take it on. And so I raised my hand and started working with him in his final weeks to start to better understand. I had a rough understanding of what was going on, but it was still pretty fuzzy at that time. And so working with him over as he transitioned out allowed me to pick up a lot of those skills and then continue to build on it once that was under my management, sort of.
And how old were you when you really decided that you wanted to make that switch from mechanical engineering to, DevOps and software development?
Yeah, so let's see. I would have been 28 or 29.
Yep.
And then I think I started at that health tech company in 2018. So yeah, right around 29 or 30. So just optimally placed for your channel. Just been coding after 30 minutes.
Yeah. It's so funny. It's like, I'm like actually just turned 41 and people are like, you got to rename your channel. I'm like, no, I don't, because it's for people that went through the struggles that I went through, like when I was in my mid 30s, early 30s, just to make that decision. But that's cool. And in terms of so I like how you point out that you shouldn't just jump into DevOps, because I think a lot of people get excited and they get kind of, there's so much stuff on YouTube, regardless if it's software engineering, if it's DevOps, it's like so hot, you just say like Docker, Kubernetes, you just throw those terms around and people get excited. It's like, and they just like, that's what I'm going to do. That's what I'm going to do. And, and there's so many channels, I'm not one of them, that promote that you could get there in 2-3 months doing boot camp or some sort of course. I don't know if that's possible or not, but based on your description, there's a lot of moving parts, and that it's definitely something that you have to commit long term. And so I guess what I try to dissuade people from doing on my channel is to jump into things that they're trying to jump into because they think it's going to solve their money issues. I'm not saying money is not important, but if you don't have some sort of the capacity to do those things, it's going to be a very painful learning experience. So any tips in that regard, if someone's looking to get into it, what would you recommend the steps would be outside of having some basic knowledge of the web like you described, or IT stuff?
Yeah, I think the easiest way to transition into DevOps type activities is going to be from a position that you already have, and that's a little bit of a cop-out. Like I said, I was working for this company already as a full stack engineer. Somebody needed to manage the infrastructure, and so when that person left, there was an opportunity there. I think in a lot of cases that's the easiest way to go. I think you can gain experience in this type of work on your own, building out full stack projects and deploying them. There's nothing that prevents someone from building out a portfolio. And yes, it's not going to be a flashy front end portfolio with nice 3D animations, but you can have multiple. You can have your whole application hosted on GitHub with GitHub Actions to deploy it to GCP with staging environments and production environments, and manage to do all that without racking up, as long as you don't make a big mistake, without racking up more than a few dollars a month in terms of cloud charges. I think. Actually, I just got a bill from AWS for $5, and I was like, "Uh-oh, what did I do wrong? It should have only been." Usually, it's only 50 cents, so I must have done something this month and forgotten to tear it down.
Yeah, it's funny like how like a web development portfolio is different from what you would use because everything is like hidden behind like this black box they should build. It's kind of like funny because it's like what that's the full app right there, but it's all the other stuff that's underneath and stuff. Yeah, that's cool, and I like the tip from like the best bet is to go from if you're already working somewhere, and I didn't go this route, and I left the company because the company actually wasn't that great, but they actually had no real solution for deploying anything, even though they were building a web app. And I was like, somebody should at least know how to do it. And they were using just like very traditional, like Windows-based stack. You just put on a server somewhere, but like it's not scalable. Also, the way they were managing.
And somebody just literally logged in and copied the new code and restarted the app.
Yeah. And then they would manage all the database locally. And it like if the hospital, for instance, I was managing hospital stuff. If they didn't back up their information and disappeared, it would be like a nightmare. And like I'm like amazed that they didn't try to come up with like a process or a system where everything's deployed on the cloud using like whatever the coolest services now that makes sense, where it prevents like a lot of headaches and a lot of risk of huge loss. Especially when you're dealing with, like in today's world, I was kind of shocked that they were literally storing things at one location at the hospital because you're dealing with like billing, you're dealing with like medical records, and I'm like, is there like a law against this? Like, I mean, like you shouldn't because if you lose that data, there's got to be some sort of penalty. So it's insane that there's a lot of people that still small companies that still do things differently. So in terms of getting to DevOps, going from a company, what was the first actually, let me back up a little bit. When you were working as a full stack developer, what was your tech stack? Like what technologies did you use before moving on to DevOps? Just to give people an idea.
Yeah, sure. So the primary application was written in Node.js. It was React on the front end. There were also Python services doing various things. So there was some machine learning work. So this health tech startup essentially helps to collate people's medical records, which are normally distributed across all these different siloed systems, bring them together under the control of the patient, and then use machine learning with a human in the loop to add additional labels on top of that. So there was a lot of machine learning around extracting real information from these medical records, whether that's figuring out what lab test it corresponded to and the values and the reference ranges, trying to pull out mentions of specific diseases and progression of those diseases from the doctor's notes. And so there were a bunch of Python services that were running those machine learning algorithms, a Node.js primary app, React on the front end, and that was all deployed onto GCP in Kubernetes. So there's the stack.
Nice. Before we continue, there's some questions. Don't want to neglect them. So one was from your CAD days, I guess. I don't know anything about it, but would Autolisp be DevOps from that perspective?
So I saw that question and I had to Google what Autolisp was. So I have it pulled up here. Is a dialect of the programming language Lisp built to use with AutoCAD. So presumably it's a software interface to one of these CAD systems. I think in and of itself, Autolisp is not DevOps, but you could certainly apply DevOps principles to a mechanical engineering workflow. Like for example, if every time you made a new revision on a part in CAD, maybe that kicks off a build that does the stress analysis and does a bunch of things, almost like a CICD pipeline for code, but you could have the same concept of a CI pipeline for a mechanical part. And then let's say it passes the test in that CI pipeline, maybe then it kicks off an automated build either with CNC or 3D printed thing, or maybe it just faxes down to the machine shop for Joe or Jane to go build that thing.
Yeah.
But yeah, then I think you could definitely apply those same principles.
Yeah. And then Luke is wondering how much you love PowerShell.
I actually have written very little PowerShell. Mostly I work with Linux-based systems. You certainly can apply DevOps to Windows, but I think 80+% of all servers these days are Linux-based, and so I just haven't really dove into the Windows world.
Was the Windows server from Docker something recent, or have they had that for a while? Because I know a lot of the stuff was Linux-based.
They've had Windows-based containers for a while. I just have never had the need to use them.
Yeah.
I've worked mostly with GCP, a little bit with AWS, and very
Yep.
little with Azure. And so AWS and GCP, I don't think have any Windows-based servers. They might have some, but I think primarily if you're doing Windows, you'd be on Azure. So
Yeah,
I
yeah,
just
that's
haven't come
true.
across it.
Yeah. And so from like, since you just brought that up, like I know there's a bunch of cloud services, but obviously the biggest one is Amazon. And is that the route would you like recommend people go if they're just starting out, versus like getting into and using Azure and the Windows-based stuff?
I think,
Or is it just based on the project?
Yeah, I think AWS is certainly the leader. They have the largest market share. They have the most services. I don't know if most services is a useful metric, but if you go to their console page, it's like
yeah, that's what
175 different things that you can choose from. Really, there's only about 10 that you need to know to get started. Like you need to know EC2, Elastic Compute Cloud. So that's just, if you want a virtual server running in an Amazon data center, it's called EC2. So go find that. If you need DNS, it's called Route 53. If you need a place to store big files or objects, it's called S3, a simple storage service. And so I actually have a video on my channel that lays out 10 services that you should get started with on AWS. I think don't try to get overwhelmed and learn everything, because nobody knows everything. It's impossible when there's that many services and they're all coming together and being released that quickly. I think AWS actually has a slightly steeper learning curve than GCP does. Something about GCP is just a little more simple and made sense. It is also the cloud that I started with, so maybe it's just because I have the most experience there, it seems simpler to me. But I think getting started on any of the hyperscale clouds, so the three that we've mentioned so far, GCP, AWS, and Azure, are all good. There's also this tier of slightly smaller clouds that I would say includes Linode, DigitalOcean, Vultr. Those are much more simplified. Those probably only have 10 to 15 services, and they line up with those core ones that I was describing. They aren't used by as many big companies because I think there's a few key features around permissioning that are harder to implement on those types of clouds.
Yeah.
But if you're just getting started as an individual, they can be a great way to go as well.
Yeah. So like if you're maybe like a web developer and you just want to self-host your stuff, starting with Linode or DigitalOcean is probably going to be like a lower like barrier to entry in terms of stuff you have to learn. Yeah,
I think so. DigitalOcean tends to have quite good documentation as well. They all do, around like how to get started on certain things. I've actually done some work for Linode, making videos on how to use Terraform, which is a infrastructure as code tool to automatically provision resources there. So yeah, there are a number of different options. I think any of the ones that we've mentioned are perfectly fine to get started with.
And let's look at some questions.
Sure.
Not a lot of questions, so we'll just answer the question. Will DevOps always use things like K8, or are there others things, and I don't know what others that you prefer, tools that you prefer?
Yeah. So Kubernetes is a platform you can deploy onto. It's a container orchestrator. Other competitors to Kubernetes would be something like Apache Mesos, which allows you to take a set of compute resources and turn it into a unified cluster that you can interact with. There's also HashiCorp has a product called Nomad, which is in that same space. I think these days Kubernetes is the clear leader. Like the growth within that project and adoption is kind of insane relative to other platforms that are out there. Obviously, things will continue to get better and eventually something may overtake it. But right now, for large scale deployments, it seems to be the clear winner. For smaller scale stuff, I think it's overkill for a lot of use cases. If you have a single monolithic application that you are deploying, you do not need Kubernetes to do that. It just adds additional layers of abstraction and complexity, and you would probably be better suited with either just maybe building a AMI, which is like basically an image for a virtual machine on Amazon, and putting that into an auto-scaling group of servers that will scale up based on load, and just be done with it. I think once you start to break things out into microservices, Kubernetes provides a lot of niceness around managing that, that you would otherwise have to build yourself. And so I think understanding when you want to migrate from a simple solution to a platform like Kubernetes is really a key question that you should ask in the development cycle. Or even just going with like a platform as a service, like a Heroku or an App Engine or I think Elastic Beanstalk on AWS are a great way to get started.
Yeah, like most of my stuff is like Heroku and Netlify, and I am curious, and I will need your help with this for sure. Just getting started something with like a Docker container and spinning it up and getting it set up for like web development stuff. I think it'll be cool to like learn more about that. But to follow up question, Andy Point asked, can you explain CI or CD? Like, I have no idea what that refers to. I'm not sure.
Sure.
That makes sense.
CI/CD is continuous integration, continuous delivery, or continuous deployment. So CI is the concept that every time you every time you merge new code or push new code to your GitHub or wherever you're storing your source code, you want to run some set of tests and checks to make sure that that code is good. And so that's the integration piece of like, every time there's a PR, you should have links to where you've run your automated tests so that the person reviewing that pull request can go check it and say, okay, this one failed, so I'm not going to merge it, obviously. CD is the second half of that. So let's say once you've merged in the code, then what do you do with it? A lot of companies will have a staging branch that every commit that gets merged into the main branch will trigger a deployment to staging. And so that often happens in the same system. Some, like if you're using Circle CI or GitHub Actions or GitLab, they all have these capabilities. Oftentimes then when you trigger a release or tag a release within GitHub, that would kick off a build that would go to production. So you have your staging environment, your production environment. And so CI/CD is just sort of the combination of all that into 4 letters and a slash.
Nice. Like the full cycle that you should follow to successfully deploy an app and have the least of issues because you follow the right steps. Yeah, guys, I also linked to Sid's channel. He's got a lot of like great stuff. The funniest thing about your channel is that I saw why M1 Mac is not the best for development at the time, but I already made my order, and I was like, the video was awesome, by the way. And I'm glad that since that day, they did add a lot of features that like I need for my workflow. And I just saw that not too long ago, they added Docker support. I haven't checked out your Docker video with M1. I think you have one. That's like on my playlist to do. Yeah. So
that video was wild. I put it out. It was like the one video in that first week that M1 came out that wasn't just a glowing review, but just highlighting some incompatibilities that I saw. That was why I was not buying it at the time, and it just took off immediately. I think that video has 5x any other video on my channel, and it's actually like outside of my niche slightly. So I don't know. It's funny.
No, it was good. It was good. And it's a great way, because that's how I found you too. Like if you haven't made that video, I probably would not know who you are. So it's amazing how like content like that brings people together. And like, what I wanted to talk to you about, that's actually, since we're on this topic, it's like, why do you have a YouTube channel? Because you have a good career path. I know some of the reasons, but I want to kind of walk you through the process for some people who are listening. And, because the bit that I liked, I guess you were on Kevin's live show where he talked about contracting, and you were like, it's a great way to either pre-qualify clients or to show that the things that you're solving is something that they are looking to be solved, and it's a great way for them to contact you because you're kind of building authority in this like DevOps space. And I was like, that's like genius, and it's like, you're not having YouTube, and I have a like huge gripe with it, and I'm kind of somewhere in the middle, but there are YouTubers that are doing it for the sake of YouTube and drama, entertainment sells, so they give a lot of advice that are fun to listen to, but then you don't accomplish anything. You just wasted time, but you kind of don't feel guilty because it was entertaining and good. And what I like about your channel, it's like you talk about the things that you're doing because the goal is to get better in your career path. And I'm trying to make sure that I grow my channel in a way that like I want to be a developer. That's what my main thing. And I like these conversations like we are having today, even though from my standpoint, whenever I have like a more of a technical stuff or something that, and it's not like we go into great detail, it's always gets the least amount of views. But I know the people that are watching it are the people that are going to benefit from it, because those are the people that are going to take actions on the stuff because they're really interested in what they're doing. You know what I mean?
Yeah, no.
So it's frustrating sometimes with YouTube.
And I mean, we're all in it for that just sweet AdSense cash money, right? I get so much. I think $2 a day is what I'm making. So
yeah,
just take it and I just run to the bank.
That's like you're basically able to survive off dollar menu at this point if you had to.
That's right. That's right.
No, big dreams.
I created. Yeah, exactly. Dream big. I created my channel primarily just because I enjoy the process of learning and building and teaching things. So I was in a period after that role that I was describing at the startup where I was quite burnt out and just needed some time to decompress mentally and work on my own mental health. And so during that period of time, I knew I wasn't ready to apply to a full-time job yet. But I also didn't want to just sit there at home and do nothing. And so in that period of time, I started my blog at DevOpsDirective.com. I started the YouTube channel as an outlet for me to sort of figure out how to continue with building my own knowledge and then sharing that knowledge with other people. So it was more intrinsically motivated than even the benefit that you described, which has been a good one of like demonstrating expertise and bringing inbound interest in my consulting work. That was not even on my radar up front.
Wow,
it was almost entirely just, I need to do something with my time that will be productive. And this is something that I think I will enjoy. And it was a very slow grind for the first 8 months. Like I think my first video is in February of 2020. I didn't hit 1,000 subscribers until November of 2020. And so that first year is just like, you put out a video, you get 10 views in the first day. Yeah. And then, and so but it slowly builds and you start to figure out how to write better scripts, how to explain yourself more clearly, how to play the YouTube thumbnail game.
I still have to figure that one out.
I mean, title, thumbnail, content, it all starts to come together, and then you take enough swings and stuff starts to hit. And I had the Apple M1 video went pretty viral, and then I have a few others that are just kind of evergreen content, great explanations that get a lot of search traffic. That's
awesome. So what is your goal like moving forward with your YouTube?
Yeah, I want to keep growing it. What I've done recently is switched up the type of content a little bit just because I wanted to find things that I enjoyed more. So I've really been enjoying adding this live stream series that I do called DevOps Office Hours, where one or more people come on the channel. We spend between 1 and 2 hours sort of hacking, pair programming on some challenge together. And so sometimes they're more junior, sometimes they're pretty senior. Doesn't really matter. We just come and attack some problem that they're facing or work that they're doing, and talk through the process. And so sometimes we get stuck and people just see us sitting there Googling things, scrolling through Stack Overflow, stumped, and hopefully offer their own suggestions. But I think it's fun for me to do. I think the people who come on the show as guests really appreciate it. The audience is seeing what it really is like to build out some of these systems and run into those configuration bugs that are really hard to track down because they're just one character's wrong or one command line flag is wrong. And so that one's been a lot of fun. I also just added a interview series, so more of like a podcast style. So interviewing tech leaders about their companies and the systems that they've put in place, both on the DevOps and cloud infrastructure sides of their business and how that has scaled as their company has grown. And so that's been really interesting. Those ones actually are performing quite poorly, which is frustrating because I think they're the most interesting stuff I've put out.
I was about to say that to you. Like, is that stuff like that where it matters because you're working in the field? These are the insights that you're like, oh man, if I only knew this, this will make me go higher, but that's not what sells on YouTube. And it's frustrating too, because the videos you're describing like is the stuff that I want to make, but at the same time, it's like not that many people are going to watch it. But I think the people do watch it. They're there because they're really benefiting from the content and they're getting a lot out of it. Like, I think like my consensus has been, I talked to like a bunch of people just to kind of like, there's so many YouTubers out there, that it's like, I don't know if you watch those videos or those commercials, like Make Money Online, how like in 10 days you could make 100K. There's a lot of YouTubers in the space of web development or whatever, like insert name, that's the type of content they make, and they sell courses, and they know that people will buy courses, but only like 1% will ever finish. They don't care because they make their money. There's nothing wrong with that. Like, I say that, you are free to do whatever you want, but at the same time, people that fall for that type of content, and this is what I actually had people tell me, is that like a year goes by, 2 years goes by, and they realize they still hadn't landed that job. They still haven't moved on to the thing they wanted. And they're so frustrated because it's like, look, I thought that's what you had to do. Watch that content, like do those tutorials. And at the end of the day, I got nothing. And that's like on my channel, because it's Coding After 30, I want to help people to understand that don't fall for the hype, and make sure you follow like if you're in the DevOps space, like follow your channel, right? Because you're getting a lot of valuable advice, that will actually help you to further your career, because you're not learning like the day in life of like my drone footage flying over my house, like check out my car, like whatever type of nonsense. And so like, it's a shame that a lot of people will not watch that content, but at the same time, like I'm still gonna want to make like content like that. And that's one of the reasons I wanted you to have on, because like I want to have conversations like this, conversations that actually, if people watch it, they're like, oh wow, so this is the path, or this is what I have to do. It's no like fluff. It's just the reality of people like, working in their field and sharing their, knowledge.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think in any industry, in any field, there's going to be way more beginners than there are experts. I think that's just a fact. Like, it takes a long time and a lot of hard work to get to the expert side of the spectrum. And so there's going to be way more beginners. Also, inherently, I think with software, more junior people are more likely to seek out video content for their way of learning, just because it really holds your hand along the process, and you see every character that needs to be typed and the full process, versus I think a more senior developer often will go read the documentation before, maybe if they really get stuck, then they'll go find a YouTube video. And so just acknowledging that fact and coming to terms with that is important for me, as I do start to balance of like, yes, I know that I can do this more beginner content and it will do better in terms of views. But is that where I'm going to make the most impact? Because there's already content out there that covers that. Yeah. It's not as tough. Like, they can go figure that out on their own. Yeah. I want to show the real world gnarly situations that you get into when you're building systems. And so wherever I can do that and highlight those, even if it means I'm not going to get as many views, I think is important to do. But I struggle with that personally, like knowing, like I want to get a good video. Like, I don't want to see the 9 out of 10 or 10 out of 10 on my rankings. So yeah, it's definitely a balance.
But what I realized, like people that make a lot of content for beginners, and I stopped trying to do tutorials. Like, I'll do some like challenges to kind of help people prepare for like coding interview, and start from beginner and then do some like harder stuff eventually, just so I could get better. But also at the same time, that's like something that leads them to doing well in an interview and possibly getting a job. But I see that like if your business is selling, like it's fine. Like, I'm just my thinking out loud. If your business is selling courses, you're gonna put out content that sells courses. That's common sense. Same thing if you target as beginners and you want to do tutorials for beginners, that's the content you're gonna put out. But like, I had so many frustrating people come to me and basically say like look, like I've been doing all that stuff, but I'm still not ready to get a job because there's no bridge. Like, what is the step to go from beginner to that intermediate role and like tackle topics that you're talking about? Like, from that standpoint, like because you're, farther along in your career, like what tips would you give for someone who's starting out as a beginner, and what can they do to kind of make sure that they spend the least amount of time as a beginner and start kind of moving towards more intermediate or, advanced?
Yeah, I think that's a question that everyone asks themselves at some point during their career. And I had a weird entrance into software because I had spent a number of years as an engineer, but not a software engineer. So I had sort of matured my engineering mindset and how to work within teams and how to think about systems problems. But I had not matured my just raw coding horsepower yet. So I was at this weird imbalance where I came into that first role and I was a senior member of the team, but I was not a senior software engineer, right?
Yeah.
And so I actually struggled with that a lot mentally, of like, I would be ashamed of not knowing how to do something when it would have been way more healthy mentally and beneficial for the company and team had I just been open about that and said, hey, I don't know how to do this. Can I pair program with insert senior engineer here,
Right.
or insert junior engineer who just has more context on the problem, or is much better at data structures and algorithms than I happen to be. That would have been beneficial for all parties, but mentally I was not ready to do that. And so coming out of that role, I became much more comfortable with saying I didn't know how to do things and asking for assistance in those places. And so that's one of my biggest pieces of advice that I give to anyone, but especially junior engineers, is don't be ashamed of not knowing something and be willing to ask for help. And that's not saying every 30 minutes when you come across something that's a little bit difficult, you need to wave the white flag and say, come help me. It means figure out what that right boundary is of, I've tried to figure this out for 45 minutes. I've done my Googling. I've simplified the problem and tried some tests. I'm still not quite there. Now is the chance to bring in the help, and I can show, here's what I've tried. It's not working. And likely that person will say, oh, here's why it's not working, and let me help you. And that allows you to then internalize that help and build on it versus just having someone sort of spoon feed you the answer over and over.
Yeah. And I think that's the like same kind of point I came on to, like when I was learning. That's where most of the improvement happens, is when you try to solve issues on your own. You get stuck, and then you do enough like research, you look on Google, Stack Overflow, what have you. And it's also important, like you said, if you're working somewhere, to have the resources to ask someone for guidance but you first have to try to sit with the problem yourself, for sure. And that's what I think, like, a lot of people are afraid to jump into, and they just keep going at least in the web development space. Like, I know people that just go tutorial after tutorial after tutorial, and then when you ask them to build something from scratch, they can't do it. And you brought up, like, in just talking about your perspective, how you are a senior engineer because of your mechanical engineering, but as a software developer, you were lacking the fundamentals when you just making that transition. Where it's funny, in terms of beginner web developments, they start solving their problems in the code editor typing, which is, you realize, is not the way to do it. And I was actually gonna ask you, from your standpoint, being an engineer, where the whole point of engineering degree, I was talking to Ande Ponte too, like at this point, is that you learn how to system think and solve problems. And that is actually the most important part that you develop. And I guess, in my case, the knowledge that you have from your background is the more important knowledge than the actual coding, because coding is a tool where your ability to problem solve is like a real asset, because it really requires you to solve a problem that you're having and implement it. And you could implement the steps that will get to the solution, even though you yourself can't code it at the time. But then anybody could code, kind of idea. And so, like, I know it's kind of tough ask, but if you had to kind of compress what you learned as a mechanical engineer, or how should people think about problems, like if they have a problem that they're looking to solve?
Yeah, I think one thing that you often do in the mechanical engineering world is think about simplifying assumptions. So the real world is this infinitely complex system where every molecule in your material is interacting with the molecule next to it. There's no way that you're going to be able to analyze it at that level. If you did, you would spend months running your simulations and finally get some result. And so the process of taking the real world, which is this crazily complex thing, and simplifying it as much as possible. And so you'll do something like a finite element analysis where now instead of every molecule interacting with each other, you can separate your structure into different beams and how they interact with each other and do an analysis that way. And that allows you to get an approximation of the real world in your simulations and your designs. And so applying that same principle to a software engineering problem and breaking it down, one, into its constituent components, but two, thinking about where you can shave off complexity by making simplifying assumptions that are not going to ruin the result. So if you simplify things too much, you throw away the answer, because now you're just not even representative. But understanding and working towards finding that threshold of how can I simplify this problem enough such that I can get a meaningful result, and maybe it's not the result that will stand forever, but it's at least a place to get started, I think is a key skill that you can, a key approach that you can take and a key skill that you can apply. Actually, that was one of the things that I was best at, I would say, coming into that role, is we were a startup and we were having to do all sorts of things to understand, I don't know, we needed to let's say assess how much each customer was costing across this complex operational system that included compute costs, it included human costs, it included all sorts of things. And so they had struggled for a while coming up with this sort of initial model of assessing how much it costs and what were the levers to affect that cost for an individual customer, right? And so one of the things that I was tasked with was to come up with that initial model and just being willing to say, okay, here's how we're going to simplify this and break it down in terms of here's an assumption that I'm making and here's how it's going to impact the result. And here's why it is a valid starting point, even though I know it's not 100% accurate. And being willing to make those assumptions and turn it from a problem that was intractable and just so complex to solve from a software engineering standpoint into something that I could solve with an Excel sheet, even I didn't even need to write code. I made a little Excel sheet and gave us a starting point. And so understanding when to make those assumptions and how to use them to your benefit is a key aspect that can help to leverage or amplify your ability to at least make progress on a problem.
Yeah. So to follow that up, is there a problem that somebody came to you for your contract role or what have you? And can you describe, again, big high level overview, what steps did you took before implementing the solution? What is the thought process behind it?
Yeah.
It's
Yep. So I can go through that one example I was describing earlier about the website generator thing.
Yeah.
Where they came to me with this concept. They said, we have these data and we want websites for the customers. And they immediately started throwing out potential solutions of here's how I think we could do it. And so some of those solutions were very complex, included Kubernetes. Some of them included all sorts of things, right? And so the key thing there was, before I ever even signed a contract to get started working with them, was just asking a number of questions about what the use case really was. How often did these sites need to be updated? Do they need to be dynamic? Do they need to have a server, or could they just be a static site with the front end component being there as static files? Just asking a number of questions to help rein in the infinite complexity of their problem statement and turn it into, okay, we have these data already in our database. We want a static website and we want it to be super affordable and automatic. And even just getting to that point was such a smaller problem space than we had started with, of just we know we want websites and And so helping them to understand what they really want and asking the right questions to guide along that path, at which point then I was able to come up with a proposal that said, okay, here's 2 different ways we can accomplish the task that we set at hand. Here's the route that I would propose. And then we chose that, and I went off and implemented it. So early on, asking the right questions and really interrogating the problem space to make it as well defined as possible, I think is really the key.
So basically, you're just asking the right questions to be able to define a clear scope on which you could act. And a lot of times the client doesn't even know what that is. And that's where your job is to make sure that you're almost like not leaving every stone unturned, so you could get a clear, like finite, like understanding of what the problem is, so you could go ahead and solve it. As like
yeah, exactly. That's a great summary. I think both from and it just makes the experience so much better from both sides, where now the client, I'm able to give an estimate that is quite accurate in terms of how long I think it's going to take, because it's well defined. If it's
right.
ill
So define
defined,
your problem.
I don't know, it might take a month, it might take 4 months. Like,
Might take
we gotta decide what you want. Yeah.
Yeah. And once you pass that step, then you kind of like, so then I just implement it. But what is that again? Like, I know it's very hard to describe all this stuff, but what does that look like for you? Do you like sit down? Do you write it on a piece of paper? Like you map things out, kind of where things are before you even start, actual work, you know what I mean? It's like, what is the planning process? I guess the question would be, once you know the scope.
It varies. Oftentimes I insert myself into whatever planning process they use. So if they use Jira, then I'll use Jira. If they use GitHub issues to track their progress, then that's what I'll use. Sometimes I'll have suggestions on how to improve their systems around the software development lifecycle, but I try to make my work fit into their process as much as possible.
Yeah.
It also varies project to project. Some projects are pretty much completely isolated from the rest of the scope of work that's happening at the company. Like the one I just described was sort of this new add-on feature that didn't impact things, the day-to-day operations, at least until it got integrated. And so that one, I was able to define it off as its own thing, sort of set up this proof of concept, get it working, showcase the progress along the way, bring in real data to build it out further. Other times, it does require more interaction with the team itself. And so for those types of engagements, I'll be sometimes in the company stand-up meetings to understand the progress of things, updating them on how my work will impact theirs. So I think integrating myself into their process is what I try to do, and then break things down into bite-sized chunks and then go tackle them.
Yeah, and from your standpoint, just like because of your experience that you have in the most like general sense, you know the tools you have available to you to solve certain particular cases. So it basically comes, once you understand what they're looking for you, because you have your prior experience and understanding of the tools and what you do, you're able to implement it. So there's not maybe too much trial and error trying to figure things out. Or do you still find that there's some of that,
Yeah, there's always some of that.
Yeah.
And yeah, I have a set of tools that I'm quite familiar with, but then there's always trying to keep on top of what the newest thing is and whether it's a good fit for the particular application that we're dealing with. And that's one thing that is challenging about my current consulting offering is pretty broad. It's just like, I can do a lot of things. I'm a DevOps generalist. I'm considering shifting towards more specialization where I would really target, let's say, companies who are trying to migrate off of Heroku or App Engine onto a Kubernetes-based system. That would help constrain the problem further so that I could dive even deeper. And yes, I know how Kubernetes works and have helped companies do that type of thing. But by narrowing the offering, I would be able to really hone those skills and develop sort of the tool set and speed with which I could come in, help a company do that migration, train their team up on these technologies, and then send them on their way to move to the next client. I think that could be an interesting thing where likely I could charge a lot more for going even more specialized in that way.
Yeah, no, it's great. And like for past couple of years, you've been mostly doing freelancing, you would say? Or you're like 100% all freelancing now? Or
the last year and a half, freelancing has been my primary income. I split time between freelance and content creation. I say on
Yep.
average, I average about half time freelance work, plus or minus, depending on the week and how many clients I have at that particular time. And then reserve the remaining time to do video stuff and other written content, etc.
Yeah. Yeah. And what's the time split between your content creation and your freelance work? Like, and when I say freelance, like I'm including everything, like not just the actual labor, but the billing and whatever else comes with that, just
Sure, yeah.
to kind of get an idea.
I'd say it's about 50-50, slightly more weighted towards freelance. I have deliberately not tried to add more work currently because I want to keep time open for the other stuff. I've also been very lucky to have one client that is kind of an anchor client that I've had for quite some time. And so that reduces the amount of business development that I need to do. And that one's pretty stable. And so, yes, I can bring on a smaller project for a few months and service that. But having this anchor client really helps quite a bit.
So between your content creation and your business, how many hours a week do you work?
Yeah, tough to say, given that the content stuff ebbs and flows when you're feeling creative and how things are going. And do you count time on Twitter as content creation or not?
Yeah, right.
But yeah, I'd say, I mean, it's generally like a normal full-time role. I wouldn't, probably between 40 and 50 hours.
So you're at a point where you're able to, because that's the hardest thing for people to do, is find that balance in their life where they're able to not overdo it because some people work 80 hours a week, you know what I mean? And it's like, maybe that's something you have to do when you're starting out. What would you say your time normalized after you kind of got to a point where you feel like, okay, this is where I want to be? Or have you always set this limit? Look, I have my personal life, so for my professional life, I'm going to dedicate 40 to 50 hours a week. Or was there a time where you were just like, man, I just got to do what I have to do?
So I've had both experiences. So my first engineering role was with a company called Lockheed Martin, which is a large defense contractor. At a company like that, you are tracking your hour to the 15 minutes and billing to specific projects. And if you go over, I think 44 hours a week, then you start getting paid overtime, but that's not usually authorized. So you literally can't work more than 40, 50 hours a week. So that time it was no problem at all. It was kind of, that's the way it is. That's how all of my coworkers were. When I joined the startup, I struggled with separating work and life, and I was probably working closer to 60 plus hours a week, not because it was pressured by the company, but I sort of felt that I needed to inherently, of like, there's always so much to be done. There's so much more to do than tasks or than people to do it. Every single thing, when your team is that small, I think I joined as the 6th engineer. Every single thing that you do feels like such a big portion of what the company needs done.
Yeah.
That I had a really hard time sort of shutting off and feeling like it was okay to shut the laptop and go do life stuff. And so that ended up, there were a number of factors, but that ended up leading me to a place where I was quite burnt out and needed a break. And so that's when, beginning of 2020, I stepped away from that role, transitioned all my responsibilities, and that's sort of the start of the YouTube channel, the freelance work. And freelance has been very healthy for me from a mental health perspective of keeping clear separation between work and life, in that most of my contracts I charge hourly. I've done full project-based stuff, or there's kind of a retainer model as well, but hourly makes it super clear. This hour I'm charging, this hour I'm not, and I don't feel bad about not charging because I'm not like there's very clear expectations on both sides of that relationship of what you're supposed to get done. And there was never a feeling of, oh, like I should just work a little harder and get this done because they're paying me for this contract and I deliver on that contract. And it was very healthy for me coming out of a place where I was overworking and had blurred lines between work and life, to have that separation.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. Like for me, I think just because I started late in life and I was in a business that's so different than what I'm doing now. I literally basically owned and operated mixed martial arts and Brazilian jiu-jitsu school for most of my life, which is like totally different, like brick and mortar business. And to transition to like development, I felt like I'm always going to be competing with younger like people, and I felt like I have to do whatever it takes to at least catch up to some sort of level of competency where I could get hired and do work. And for me, it has like at times consumed my life where all I do is work or study. And for me, I felt it was necessary. And like I still feel it's still necessary to make sure you keep up with that and keep improving. But at the same time, to your point, I'm like, okay, what is the hard limit of hours? Because you have to understand you have a personal life, you have other things that you have to do. And if you have a family, you got to be there for your kids, you got to do all this other stuff. And so you can't like just, and also will lead to burnout. And so like that's like something I've been struggling with. I'm better at now, especially now that I do a contract role. Like you said, they pay me hourly, so it's very easy. Like I just set a timer when I do the work, and like, and you know, and that's the time I get paid, you know, and that made it easier. But yeah, definitely like tough balance to find
Yeah.
it.
I think now that I have spent some time after my period of burnout, I think I could figure out how to handle work-life balance much better. I think having gone through a period that was pretty tough and then now figured it out in a freelance context, I think I could go back into a full-time role and better manage that. I don't know that it would be easy, but I think I could do a better job for sure.
Yeah. Yeah, by the way, guys in the chat, I know Sid asked a question. Like, definitely don't be shy. Ask questions about DevOps, any questions you have for Sid. I mean, the reason like we do this stuff, you know, as much like we love talking to each other, but you guys are our audience and we want to give you as much value, because if we answer a question that really helps you take that next step in life, it'll be awesome. So definitely ask some questions. Also want to be mindful of Sid's time. I should have asked beforehand how much time you have, but you know, we could
I'm good for the next little bit for sure.
Okay, yeah, let's do like another like 15 minutes, 20 minutes or so, whatever. And so guys,
Sounds
don't be
good.
shy. If you guys don't ask questions, like we won't be able to answer them. But while the topic is what I needed, well, ask more questions, guys. And yeah, if you haven't liked the like button, smash it, however much YouTube allows you. And definitely check out DevOps Directives, Sid's channel. He has a lot of informative, great videos, and I'll throw the link down again. But, you know,
Yeah, I've got a new video that is coming out right after this. I was working on it today about the
Nice.
GitHub Copilot.
Nice. Yeah, and guys, like I know there's so many YouTubers on YouTube and it's kind of hard to find out who you follow, but what I would say, follow the person that has the job that you want or the skill that you want, you know? So like I'm going to say it out, like if you want to make YouTube like lessons online and sell courses to beginners, follow every other channel that you guys follow. But if you want to move forward in your career, you have to understand at some point you got to put your big boy pants on and do the work and do the things that people do at their job. And so if you want to break into the field, that's what you have to do. And I know it sounds like, you know, like it's easy to give advice, because it is, but the truth is at the end of the day, you guys have to do the work to get where you're going. And if you're watching content that is wasting your time because you're not doing the thing that you want to get paid for, then you're never going to get there. And so I really started, you know, in my like managing my YouTube watching time and watching the stuff that moves the needle forward, you know, because at the end of the day, I'm 41 years old. I don't want to spend my time living on YouTube. And I always say, if my channel is preventing you guys from doing the work, don't watch my channel. But I am glad that you guys here, because without you, this channel would not exist. But so like, we need some questions, guys. Don't be shy, because I'll ask the first question. So if I wanted to start with Docker, what would be the first step? Like, it's very super basic question.
The very first step is you probably need to install it on your system. So
okay,
you can go to docker.com and
yes.
download it.
Yeah, very easy question that someone could have Googled. So I haven't, I installed Docker on my M1. I haven't tried it yet. From your experience, and I have to watch a video. I'm sorry I didn't yet. Is it like a much simpler process now after like, you know, they released the version for Mac?
Yeah, so the the version that is compatible with the ARM architecture of the Apple M1, it should make the experience quite similar on the M1 to any other system. Containers are they're kind of magic, but they're kind of not. They're just using a few Linux primitives called C groups to control what the particular container is able to access, and then namespaces is the other thing. And these are features that have been around in the Linux kernel for quite some time. And by combining them, you're able to create a process that is somewhat isolated from the rest of the system. Docker, the real revolution that Docker brought is they provide a really nice, clean interface and program for using those Linux primitives and turning them into containers that you can run very easily. Before Docker, there were containers, but the interfaces to use them were super clunky. And so by making a really nice UX, user experience, Docker was able to take the world by storm and really became the leader in terms of containers. The things that you should learn are basically how to, one, if you've never worked with a Linux-based system, if you've primarily worked with Windows, then learning some of the basics of how you install things in Linux, how you configure your application, etc. Those are going to be necessary because that's how you actually write your Docker file that defines your image and then impacts how you run those containers down the road. So yeah, I think learning some Linux fundamentals is probably even useful before you go off and try to use Docker itself. And then taking those Linux fundamentals and applying them to your Docker image, Docker files that define your images is sort of how you then transition into the container world.
All right, yeah. So there's a question, but I have another question because I have lots of questions. I guess it's here. Are you familiar with Plesk? If so, what are your opinions versus other services?
I am not familiar with Plesk. I just Googled it. It looks like almost like a cPanel competitor, like a hosting interface. Yeah, it looks similar to cPanel to me, but correct me if I'm wrong, my app. Yeah, I don't know. I haven't used Plesk or cPanel or anything like that much. I think because I'm deploying directly to one of these clouds, there is less of a need for a graphical user interface to work with on the server side. How much shell scripting do I do? Yeah, writing shell scripts is really a key skill within DevOps. There are many things that you can do with a shell script, with a relatively short shell script that would otherwise take a whole application to accomplish. There's just so many awesome Unix utilities like awk and sed and grep, and that once you start to learn this, think about things in terms of text streams that you can pipe from one program to the next and manipulate, that is a pretty powerful concept and allows you to get pretty far in terms of many tasks that you would need to do. So yeah, I use shell scripts quite a bit. Not sure if there's a follow-on to that, but quite a bit is my answer.
Basically, it's an important skill that you need to have if you're looking to do that stuff. Once you have your Docker, because I haven't done any of this stuff, so I might probably asking like questions like two-year-olds would ask. But once you have the Docker container, where do you deploy to, or how do you access it?
So the one thing that people get confused a little bit is the difference between a Docker container and a Docker image. So the image is the thing that you build. So we'll go step back in further. We've got the Docker file. Docker file is just a list of commands, essentially. It's like you start from some base. So let's say from Ubuntu, and then you say run apt-get install, and then you put a bunch of dependencies. And then let's say copy, and then you copy your source code from your laptop or your desktop into the container image. So you have this list of instructions in the Docker file. Then when you run Docker build, Docker goes off and runs those list of instructions from your Docker file, puts them into this specially formatted file system, and they call that a Docker or container image. The image is the thing. And then when you actually deploy it, you take that image and you create a container from it. So containers, if you think about object-oriented programming, if you have a class and then you have an instance of that class,
Yeah.
the image is the class and the instance of the class is the container. So you can have as many containers as you want based on one image. And that's when you have a system like Kubernetes, you can have hundreds of replicas of the same app. They're all based on the same image, but they are each their own container.
Okay, got it. Got it. Nice. And for like people that do like web development who are using services like Heroku and Netlify, maybe Netlify for their front end, Heroku for their back end, when do you know if you should move to something like Docker? If like your basic needs are being met, or what are the reasons? Because you mentioned some of your customers wanted to transition from services like Heroku and Netlify and go on to a more like Docker or whatever other solution.
Yeah, I think one of the big ones is when the premium price that you're paying for that simplicity on Heroku starts to really hurt your wallet, because you're scaling, and because the reason that they're able to charge more is because they have this magical experience that handles a lot of the nitty-gritty details of CICD and all the DevOps for you. And so oftentimes people start to run into really expensive bills, and or they have some feature that they need that is not available on one of those platform as a service. So in order to simplify things and make it a really nice experience, by definition, they kind of need to limit the set of things that are available. So they put some nice walls such that the experience is really nice, but occasionally you'll need access to the host network or something that isn't really available on one of those platforms.
Yeah. And so like for beginners, and I think, okay, who are hosting something, let's say on Heroku, whatever, and we talked about that DigitalOcean or Linode could be that intermediary step. And then if you want to get into DevOps and you're more interested, you could go up and do Docker and stuff like that. So I personally would like to learn how to deploy, basic WordPress site with Docker container, and then basic like React apps and possibly Next.js app, how that would work. And for a lot of my backend stuff, I don't make the API, from scratch myself. I use a service like Strappy, but that'll be cool to kind of learn how to deploy that with Docker. Because I think like the reason you said that once you start getting traction on Heroku, just because it's like a magic box, their pay structure could, go up pretty quickly. And so for someone like me, like I would want to have something where I'm in a little bit more control, that I'm not paying the premium for the magic that's happening behind the scene.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great way to start in terms of, as you're building out a new product, you're trying to figure out what the customer wants. And so not wasting time building out all these systems, and instead just focusing really narrow on iterating the product. And as long as you design your cost structures such that you're making revenue for each user at the right rate, then finding yourself in a position where the Heroku bill is non-negligible is a really great problem to have, right? That means you have users and they're using your app.
You're making
money, and then you can go solve it. Yeah. So I think getting started with a platform as a service is a great way to go. As you mentioned, then starting to explore what the alternatives are. You mentioned Linode and containers as discrete steps. They don't have to be different, right? You can deploy containers onto Linode. You can deploy containers onto GCP. Exactly. You can deploy containers into Heroku. They have their default. I think doesn't use containers, but they do have a container-based option. So I'm not sure where I was going with that, but
no, it's good. And then someone's like Jose saying this topic is new to me. Great stream. By the way. And I really like it. I think like anybody who's in web development should kind of understand the deployment cycle. So that way, when you're working with other people who might be in charge of it, you're able to have like a pretty good communication with them. And I think it's like you were saying, if you're in a role and you want to kind of, change within a company or take the next step, do something, maybe DevOps is like way more interesting because those are the problems you want to solve. That's a great stepping stone to kind of move up the ladder in your career rather than starting from scratch and stuff like that. Go ahead.
I'd say look for some pain point in your workflow. So let's say there's something that you end up spending 3 hours a week doing whatever that could potentially be automated. Take a few hours in that next sprint, and I mean, obviously make sure this is okay with your team and your management. But don't be afraid to say, I'm going to try to take this thing that we're wasting significant time on by doing over and over manually, and try to automate that, whether it's adding a new step to your CI process or writing a little shell script to accomplish that task. I think that's a way to dip your toes in the water of like what DevOps is all about. And it's really just this philosophy of trying to make everything that was manual automated and streamline the process for building software faster and better.
So that's a great point. Like the one problem I'm having is because I'm complete noob and I just more focus on building the stuff than thinking of how it's deployed, at least at this point. And so there have been instances where I would break something in Heroku and then I would try to fix it and I break it even more. And then like backpedaling, trying to figure out what was the last working thing. And then by the time I get there, it's so far behind. Like I'm thinking, like you were saying, you could have many instances of a container or what have you. Like, does that solve like that problem a little bit in a sense? Again, like I don't know anything, but would that make it easier if you break something where you could just start fresh from like the last working, build that you had, or I don't know if like my question even makes sense. But that's
the question makes perfect sense. So
but that's a legit problem.
I mean, what most companies do, if you're using containers, this is how you would do it, is with each version that like I said earlier, if you merge new code into the main branch, I build a staging container. What I usually do is then tag that container with the commit hash that's associated with that commit. And so that's a unique identifier for that version. When we do a release, we'll have the v1.1.4, whatever. That is the tag of the container. And so let's say a bug does make it through. We deploy 1.1.5. All hell breaks loose. Customers are seeing downtime. What I can then do as an engineer is go in, tell Kubernetes or whatever my deployment system is, okay, change from tag 1.1.5, take all those, remove them, and put in replacements with the last version, 1.1.4. And hopefully that'll at least stop the bleeding while we go and figure out what the issue is and create a patch for that.
And because you mentioned staging, I'm assuming that problem you just described, you probably don't even have, because you guys go to staging first and then from there deploy, like if everything works, deploy. Is that the process you guys follow?
That's the idea. Staging doesn't always represent production, right?
Oh, okay.
There's some problems that you're only going to find when you're under load. Like let's say there's someone added a really slow query, and so on staging, if there's only a few test users, it's fine. It's like but then you get like thousands of users hammering your database, and stuff starts to break down. And so there's some things that you're going to find in production. There's lots of tools and tooling that you can use to help improve that. There's deployment strategies where you can put both versions of the code out and configure it so that, let's say 10% of traffic is going to go to 1.1.4 and
that's cool.
90% is going to go to 1.1.3. And so that way you can start to try and detect errors in the 10%. And if it goes well for the first 15 minutes, then you'll shift the percentages over time and eventually move all the traffic onto the new version. So that's called a canary deployment, where you have a portion of the traffic going onto the new version. Those are the canaries in the coal mine testing out whether it's working properly or not. You'll monitor for things like latency of responses, error rates, etc. And then assuming all the statistics on the metrics look okay, you slowly transition to the new version fully.
Yeah, no, awesome. And I see in chat not a lot of like people asking questions, which is okay. Sometimes it happens, especially it's like 4th of the July weekend coming up. But I don't want to hold Sid here for too long. Like I do appreciate you coming on and chatting with me and you guys. It's awesome. And I am going to ask one last question though, because like everybody who's like looking to switch careers or what have you, they always talk about questions like, oh, you need a degree, or like I'm sure like people always ask me like, do I need a computer science degree? And I tell them, if you can't, in my personal like opinion, if you're young enough, you have the money, you're able to get the degree, or but like I was at a point where I was debt free. I'm like 41 now, so going back to school is something I have to consider, especially the fact that my family has to be okay with that. And so for me, like I really had to think hard and tough, and I took the self-taught route. But I do say, if you're able to get whatever the advanced degree, like definitely that helps in your field, do it, because you learn a lot of those problem-solving skills that I feel are, and system thinking that I feel are very hard to learn. But in the case of DevOps, number one, is college degree required, yes or no? And number two, are there certifications that actually hold some weight? I know Amazon has a bunch, like everybody has their own certifications. Is that, in your experience, how's that been?
Yeah, so two-part question. I think a degree is not required. It can be beneficial. There still is a number of companies who screen based on that. Whether they're right or wrong is another question, but I think that exists. And so having a degree certainly doesn't hurt in terms of getting your foot in the door at these places. But I do not think it is a prerequisite to being a very good employee performing DevOps and cloud infrastructure related tasks. The second part was around certifications. I don't have any certifications personally, but there are actually, I think, a number of certifications in the cloud space that do hold weight. Each cloud offers their own. There's a whole certification track on Amazon and a separate one on Google. There are Docker certifications, and the ones that I've actually been considering are Kubernetes certifications. There's 3. There's one for sort of administering Kubernetes itself. There's another one for application development on top of Kubernetes, and then there's another security focused one. And those, a number of colleagues that I've interacted with who I respect quite a bit, all have that certification and talk very highly of it. And I know, having looked at some of the practice materials, that it is not an easy task to do. And so that makes me want to set it as a challenge, to actually go off and get that. Whereas there are some certifications that, as you know, don't hold any weight, and it's just kind of silly to even get them. So I think taking a look at which ones are challenging and representative, and the people that you look up to and respect in your field, do they have these types of certifications, is the question that you want to be asking.
No, it's a very good point of view. So make sure you get the thing that matters, rather than just willy-nilly thinking you need a piece of paper to, just to say you did something. But like, I just want to thank you so much, Sid, for being here. Like, it was really awesome. I love having conversations like this, because like I learned so much. I hope a lot of the viewers learned a lot. And where could people find you? I know you have your YouTube channel, DevOps Directive. What other social media do you find yourself spending time on?
Yeah, so DevOps Directive YouTube. I also have DevOpsDirective.com if you prefer written content. And then on Twitter, I am at Sid Palace. I think I'm like 10 away from 1,000, so trying to hit that 1K mark on Twitter.
Nice.
So go find that.
Yeah, you guys go check out his channel, and he's not gonna be shooting a lot of drone footage. He's not gonna be showing his fancy car, but he is going to talk about what matters in the field of DevOps. So definitely, if that's the path you want to take, I can't recommend him enough. And with that being said, thank you all, guys. Have a great 4th of July, and we'll see you guys next time.
Take care. Thanks a lot.
Hey, thank you, Sid. And I'm never good at ending the streams. I'm like, just hit the finish button, I guess.